Eh bien, bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for the invitation to speak to you this morning. And Admiral, thank you for your generous welcome. And as I would say, Professor, thank you also for your kind words. It's rather interesting that you've asked Colonel Safari to say a few words at the end of my presentation, so I expect that to be a critique of what I'm going to be saying. That in itself is a bit unusual when we come as a guest speaker. I'm going to speak not in my maternal language, which is Québécois, or as my French cousins from France would say, 18th century French. I will use a North American English. Because it's my second language, I'm allowed to mix the Oxford and Webster pronunciations, so I hope it'll come across, however, reasonably well. It is interesting to be here and to speak to you on the subject of reconciliation, because next year we're actually going to be commemorating the 200th anniversary of the War of 1812 and a war between the States and Canada. And the question is have we reconciled that one? And I guess the celebrations, if they're celebrations, might determine it. But it's one of those unusual wars where we're not too sure which side won. If you're in Canada, the Canadians said they won, and if you're here, the Americans say they won. Except I'm convinced that we won, because the Americans came north and found this town called York or Toronto on Lake Ontario and burned it down. And I'm from Montreal, so that doesn't bother me much. But we thought we'd do you a favor, and so we went south and we found this town, this city built on a swamp. I mean, it was hot, humid, full of mosquitoes, and so we did you a favor, burn it down. And then you decided to rebuild it, and it was Washington. So I'm not too sure who got the better side of the deal. But we have, since then, maintained a rather significant friendship and a friendly border, although interestingly, in this era, which gets us into the subject of it, is the border has become far more secure and far less friendly in how we're applying security than it has ever been, even during the Cold War. And the security scenarios that we're living in North America in the sense of security has escalated a border control that in the past we thought not required. But in this era, we have imposed it. And recently, in the Senate, I was sponsoring a bill called the Shipwriters Bill, in which we have now authorized American Coast Guard and immigration people to be on Canadian ships on the Great Lakes and vice versa, because we're going after guys who are doing drugs and weapons and various smuggling. And so we've changed the nature of how we look at security in North America between two long-lost friends that have attempted to maintain this interest and this closeness. Now, I am a soldier, as many of you are, or at least a military person, as many of you are, and so I'm a very visual person, meaning I will use every pedagogical tool I can, and that means I brought with me 143 slides on PowerPoint. And it reminded me of a general in 1991 during the Gulf War. I was at the British Higher Command and Staff course at Kimberley. The course was based on the operational level of war, and at that time, during the Gulf War, we coined it as how to do Schwarzkopf's job. And in that time, we had a general called Jowan, American general, who came up to speak to us. And his aide walked to the overhead projector in those days, where you couldn't be as subtle as we are now with computers, and he brought in a pile about that thick of overheads, and we thought we were going to be in for a long haul, only to realize that he actually, at the end of his over an hour and nearly a half presentation, he had gone through only 9 of his slides. So brevity is not necessarily our strength. And I hope that somebody will keep a bit of discipline to permit time for questions. At that same course, there was an interesting professor from, I believe it was Jerusalem University, called Martin van Krefeld, who came to speak to us. And if you remember, those of you, he was the author of a series of books called Command in War, Logistics in War, and so on. But he also wrote one in 1991 called Future War, which was extraordinarily revealing of what's going on now and what we've been sort of stumbling into over the last 20-odd years since the end of the Cold War. And it is, I think, a worthwhile read still today. Although he is a bit of an unusual chap, because after formal dinner and about I don't know how many decanters of port, he came out with the statement that soldiers enjoy combat more than sex. And with that in mind, it makes it a little difficult to discuss not just conflict resolution, but ultimately conflict prevention when you are a soldier. But that is ultimately the aim of the exercise, is conflict prevention. And we have, over the last 20-odd years, been working in often ad hoc crisis mode in trying to do conflict resolution. Everything from Haiti to Afghanistan, Iraq, and sort of put to the side the old concepts of peacekeeping, Chapter 6 down here, and classic war that we were used to throughout the Cold War at the upper echelon. And as we discovered that although we had significant conceptual frameworks to build our doctrines from which we deduct our training and our equipment requirements, our organizations, and our tactics, as we stumbled into this era, we don't have that conceptual base. And so what I hope this morning to work towards is arguing that, in fact, the door is wide open, that we have not yet, over the last 20-odd years, formalized or been able to provide the depth of conflict resolution, and certainly haven't even approached conflict prevention in a multidisciplinary way. And I think the title of the forum today is significant, because I believe that reconciliation is, in fact, part of an offensive weapon that should be used for conflict prevention. And so let me work my way through the slides. Although I don't have my computer here, we'll hopefully follow them through with my notes. Working through this, I'm going to be going through a bit of history, and that'll be farther than CNN history, which is sort of last week, and bringing you to today, but really trying to project us into the future. For I believe that's the aim of what you're trying to work at, is how are we anticipating that future? How are we actually shaping that future in order for humanity not to survive, but for humanity to actually thrive? And we can speak now in this era of humanity because we can literally, in very short order, speak to the whole of humanity. I mean, we could Skype pretty well anybody we want. And so if we can actually touch the whole of humanity or approach it, that means we might be able actually to conceive solutions that cover humanity and not necessarily very singular sort of elements thereof. And that's why I put this slide up, because it's really the title of a book by this Polish journalist, and it's also an easy read. It's only got 97 pages, got no pictures though, and in it he argues that the other doesn't exist anymore. And where he is arguing is that for close to 4 centuries, the other was everybody who was not the European Caucasian and was considered the other. And that was the concept of, in fact, the world structure, and where its evolution or sort of different revolutions were evolving to. And that in this era, in the stumbling into the 20th century and 21st century, we are the other of the other. That is, everybody is the other of the other, because we are all now accessing to different levels of power, of resources, and the interconnectivity of us all now through the revolution of communications, transport, and so on. The technology has permitted us to actually stand there and simply be one of humanity, and not in any pretentious way consider ourselves one entity with everybody else being the other. And that premise, to me, is a fundamental element of whether or not we want to engage in advancing the plight of humanity, or whether we will continue to too often look at self-interest as a dominating theme. And we'll work through that also as we go through the slides. In simplistic terms, and certainly not from an academic perspective, I sort of saw the three phases of conflict being prevention, which we have not succeeded much in, and in fact I would argue we have not, in certainly this era, worked very effectively in any way, shape, or form in preventing. We've been into crisis response throughout this period, and often in crisis mode, and not necessarily in a very progressive and anticipatory way looking at the problems. And then the sort of phase of conflict is sort of the reconciliation and nation building, which is the thrust of the presentations of this seminar. And so resilience, reconciliation, and reconstruction, creating stability and peace after conflict, is, of course, an ambition and potentially a long-term exercise, but I consider it not the afterthought of conflict, but in fact the initial phase of prevention. That is to say, it gets us back into the cycle. So it's a do loop, or put it, some might even say a catch-22, is that while you are now into the mode of trying to reconcile and reconstruct a nation that has been either a failing state or an imploding nation, you are actually engaged in an offensive operation to prevent conflict from happening again. And if you don't have that sort of perspective in mind, it's difficult to maintain the impetus of the enormous stresses and strains of trying to implement a reconciliation process and, in fact, help reconstruct and help rebuild the nation according to its perspectives of what democracy would be, rule of law, good governance, human rights, gender equality, education, and so on. And so I hope that, if anything, I leave you with a feeling that when we're into the reconciliation mode of a conflict, we're actually into an offensive operation, long-term but deliberate, and that the aim of it is, in fact, to prevent a conflict from happening again. And if we do that, we are then, I believe, achieving a high level of responsibility, ultimately to protect, but responsibility to advance humanity and its serenity. Not an easy task when one looks at the nature of conflict as we've seen it, particularly since the end of the Cold War, and I hope those colleagues from other continents will forgive the sort of Eurocentric history that some of us have, and the perspective that all of a sudden that Eurocentric perspective shifted significantly in 1989, and that we entered a whole new era where we are deployed and engaged and responding into areas that have not necessarily been of our strength in the past, and that we're doing a lot of on-job training in trying to perceive what the requirements are, let alone work at preventing them. And so the nature of conflict of certainly the last 20-odd years being very much civil wars, mass atrocities, human rights abuses, imploding nations, failing states, which is such a shift from the nation-state conflicts that we were all attuned to during the Cold War and prepared to meet, has thrown us off guard. Also, much of the nature of these conflicts being of low technology has also thrown us off in regards to how do we meet these requirements and how do we wrest the initiative from the opposing sides, from the opponents that hopefully are trying to reconcile. I put that slide up just to remind us of the scale of some of the scenarios in which we found ourselves and still find ourselves today. The X's that surround Rwanda in 1994 represent 2.3 million people. The O's in the southwest, which are internally displaced person, represent 1.6 million people. Now add to that over 800,000 who have been slaughtered and nearly 1 million others who are injured or sick either from pandemics like HIV/AIDS or cholera and so on, out of a population of 8 million, and you are into a significant problem, not only in trying to manage or respond to that crisis, but how are you going to bring reconciliation after that when, in fact, the whole of the population was engaged, either as victims or as perpetrators, and in so doing at such a level of inhumanity that it would make it difficult for people to try to put in the back drawer and actually respond to it. And so we're going to use that a bit as an example. We've also entered an era where new weapon systems have been introduced that have also caught us more off guard than in fact prepared for. And one I use there as an example of our era really started in the late 80s in Mozambique, and that is the turning of armed children into a primary weapon system of conflict. Not as sort of a sideshow, but actually being the principal weapon system of a conflict. And so hundreds of thousands of children in a number of conflicts, at least 17 around the world, who have been and are continuing to be used today, armed with light machine guns and sustainable by simply the numbers, the availability of the children, and also the proliferation of small arms, has thrown us into how to respond to such a threat without necessarily overtly using force, which is by our laws permitted for an armed child, although 9, 10, 12, 14, or 16, who is using a weapon against you is considered simply as a combatant, and all the doctrines of the developed world and the developing world have identified that the right to self-defense overrides and that you are allowed to use lethal force either in your own self-protection or in protecting others. So the question is do we solve or do we neutralize that weapon system that's been introduced massively in this era by simply blowing them away? And how many children can your soldiers blow away before it starts to screw up a number of their gray cells between their ears? And is there another way or other means to, in fact, stop the recruitment and neutralize that weapon system of this era? And I would contend that this is by far the most sophisticated end-to-end weapon system that is in the inventory today. They are not only out there conducting the killing and maiming and so on, but in many of the male-dominated societies, the girls are used, and 40% of them are girls, are used for all the logistics structures, and they're also the sex slaves and bushwives. You can't find something that is meeting all those requirements in the inventory, except in that extreme. We also entered an era where people have looked at wars or conflicts with a whole different set of parameters than purely nation-state references. That is to say, power structures or coalitions or alliances, and have focused not only with, hopefully at the end game, a humanitarian perspective, but more often than not has been in a self-interest perspective, and certainly precious resources are of a significant influence. As an example, when you look at your cell phones and Blackberries and the coltan in it, and knowing that it comes from the Eastern Congo and how it's extracted and mixed in with the Australian coltan to make it ethical coltan, you sort of wonder whether or not the conflicts that are going in that part of the world should not have been resolved in order to protect or assist in ensuring that those resources are made available. So we're into conflicts for a variety of reasons, and certainly not reasons that historically were used by nation states. And furthermore, we're into an era where all the players are not playing by the same rules, which makes it that much more difficult subsequently to try to bring back the different belligerents and ultimately bring the nation to a certain level of stability and serenity when one component is actually completely outside of the grid in regards to any of the humanitarian laws of armed conflict to which we historically have based the use of force by nation states. And so if that's the case, how do you bring that back into reconciliation? Can you, through justice and applied justice, as Rwanda has been attempting with the Gacaca, which is a sort of a historic instrument of justice locally, can that override some of the actions that extremists or perpetrators used during the genocide to permit the community to reconcile and actually to live together? Can the individual who is now being brought in front of the community court and given a certain sentence for having committed crimes during the genocide, can in fact both the perpetrator and the victims that have survived actually be able to live in that village? When they're sitting on top of a hill, villages are not very large, and the individual who perpetrated the crimes, his family is still alive, his house is still standing, and the person who was victim, that person's family is probably mostly all killed, their house has been burned down, and they've been barely trying to be able to survive. And so you're into some pretty sophisticated arenas of quandaries in bringing about a reconciliation, even with the use of justice, which should be an absolute in trying to achieve that. The dimension of our era has also introduced a few innovative ideas, and not many. If you remember, Kofi Annan in 2005 attempted to bring in a series of reforms to the UN as the world body reference that we have out there. It's not perfect, but it is one of the singular instruments that are out there. And we sort of at times wonder whether we want to keep it imperfect because it makes for a great whipping horse or an scapegoat when we don't want to do something or when things go bad. And it also is an instrument from which we can keep a control by not giving it the assets it needs to do the job properly. And in so doing, use that as a reference. In the Rwandan genocide, it's been often stated that the UN was held accountable for the genocide. And I would argue that although we in the field made mistakes, and the Secretariat made mistakes, and certainly the Security Council made mistakes, the ultimate guilt of our ineptness in the field to prevent and then ultimately even to stop the genocide lies with every sovereign state capital that refused to give the UN any assets to be able to react. And so by deciding not to give the UN any assets, from mandates through resources to attempt to prevent or stop it, I would contend and hold, as I do in my book with the subtitle, The Failure of Humanity to Rwanda, is the fact that the 191 countries around the world have an element of guilt in regards to letting the genocide happen and go on, and the UN is only an easy target for those who really don't want to look at their decision making in that regard. One of the few innovative approaches that have come in that is throwing a curve into us trying to grasp how to prevent conflict and, in fact, how to resolve some of the conflict has been the introduction of responsibility to protect, which was introduced in 2005 as one of the only reforms, actually after Brahimi in 1999, to bring changes to our ability to respond to these humanitarian crises, these imploding nations, and these failing states. And it is a controversial instrument. Is it a concept? Is it a doctrine? Is it simply a philosophy? Is it a reference? Or is it something we don't want to talk about? But there are a number of us who do believe that, in fact, we've entered an era through responsibility to protect where one of the absolutes has been broken down that may permit us to be innovative. And that is the fact that the sovereignty is no more an absolute. Responsibility to protect argues that sovereignty cannot be the instrument to protect those who are perpetrating massive abuses of human rights, and that we have a responsibility through the UN to go in and to assist and protect. And so, in this era, we've got one innovative idea that was thrown in at a grand strategic scale that is keeping people on edge, to operationalize. The developing countries are worried that the big countries are going to use that as an instrument to simply bust in when they feel like it and decide to take over. What came as a surprise to us that we were working on it was that the big nations also show an enormous reticence to operationalize R2P because it might drag them into conflicts or areas that they're not interested in going in. And in so doing, they're not necessarily seeing any self-interest in that. And that is a dominant thematic, certainly on those countries that have capabilities still today. In 1994, in the first 10 days or so of the genocide, with a few reconnaissance groups from a number of countries that had capabilities of coming in, it was made evident at that time, and I would argue still exists today, that people will continue to use self-interest as a dominating thematic to ultimately even invest in preventing, let alone resolving conflict. And at that time, I remember being debriefed by a few of those recce personnel who came to me and said, "General, we're not going to recommend that we intervene or that we reinforce your mission." And when I asked them why not, they said, well, there's nothing here. There's no strategic resource. The country is not even in a strategic location of any use to us. And the only thing that's here are human beings. And there's too many of them anyways. It's overpopulated. And so the lowest criteria used at that time overtly by inaction, by not intervening, was humanity and the individual human beings and the rights of human beings to protection. And so have we shifted gears in that? Has that moved up the scale in regards to our willingness to intervene? And if it's not, then how, when we see a conflict ebbing for one reason or another, and in the case of Rwanda, it was Rwandans who stopped their own war, how do you then see reconciliation, and where do you see your role coming in afterwards in attempting to provide assistance to that reconciliation when the actual conflict was ongoing, and in front of you, in front of the TV cameras, you decided not to intervene? And it's fine for sovereign leaders or state leaders or heads of state to go to those countries afterwards and say, you know, geez, we're really sorry that we didn't come in and help. We didn't maybe realize the extent of it, and I hope you'll excuse us. Well, in many cases, they didn't know or they didn't want to know, and a deliberate decision of inaction was taken. And so from that weak position, how do you then get engaged in a credible way of assisting in that reconciliation process? For that is ultimately a role that we should have. And do we simply wait out the problem and then throw a whole bunch of cash at it, or do we actually want to assist in ultimately resolving the conflict and even preventing it? And should the conflict happen, to actually be engaged in a more supportive way. That is not answered still today. Example of that is Darfur. And so when I was our Prime Minister's lead in 2005 in Darfur, it was evident that although some heads of state called it a genocide, people were not interested in going in except throwing a whole bunch of money in humanitarian aid. That did not resolve the conflict. The people are still dying, and 2.5 million are still sitting there wondering what's going to happen. A little anecdote is when I was on patrol in southern Darfur at the time, I was with a Rwandan company. Rwanda, with the African Union under AMIS, were the first ones to go in with the Nigerians and Senegalese, with about 3,000 troops from Rwanda with next to no equipment and so on. As we were lost, which is the case there because nobody had GPSs, compasses, or even maps, and the terrain is quite difficult. And so the officers were on top of the vehicles trying to figure out where they were. And as they were doing that, I'm sitting in the vehicle. My driver, who's a sergeant, goes underneath his chair and pulls out a book. And he says, "This is our reference." And the book was my book. And I said, "I'm not sure that's a good reference because I don't think the mission succeeded." And yet it was rather interesting to see it as being a book used by those who were deployed in a complex scenario. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are in an era that is simply not classic, and I'll argue that. And with that, we've stumbled into an era of enormous complexity and ambiguity. And the question is, have we actually shifted gears in a significant way to handle this and ultimately to wrest the initiative from those who are perpetrating these conflicts and ultimately being able to assist in picking up the pieces and preventing them from re-happening? For one of the failings of our time in these imploding nations and failing states is the risk of the conflict ebbing and then coming back, and ebbing and coming back. As an example, in the Rwandan case, with extremists sitting on the border and with the ultimate genocidaire still free in some of the developed countries and not having been brought in front of the International Tribunal, which really picked up only the tactical leaders in the field, the fear of the extremists relaunching again is real. And with that fear comes a paranoia, and with that paranoia comes security scenarios that may, in fact, create frictions that prevent reconciliation from happening, as the frictions between potentially either the ethnicities or the groups, be they political or ethnic or at times tribal, will continue to keep that back of their mind idea that something could still happen because those who originally conceived the reason for the conflict are still out there and free to bring it back into being. And so ambiguity, complexity are the norm. We in uniform hate ambiguity. We tried to bring everything down to drills. That certainly was the historic way of using doctrine. The question is can we do that now? And what would be the drill in prevention of conflict, let alone in participating in the processes that will help us prevent the conflict from happening again? So the good old days of being able to actually see the conflict before it happens and to actually be able to manage it or command it really from a position of advantage are long, long gone. And even though the Cold War was massive in scale, there was nothing compared to the complexity of the conflicts that we face today and the enormous numbers of ethical, moral, and legal dilemmas in which in the field we're facing with nothing solid enough behind us to give us that warm, fuzzy feeling that we're on the right track. And I'll get to that if I may. So there are no geniuses, I don't think, and certainly if we try to strive to get precise ideas, clear vision, and concrete proposals from our political masters, then that would certainly help us in ultimately achieving our aim. That is the realm of genius, and that is simply pie in the sky. What we have is a whole series of factors now interfacing, of which we still don't know the full breadth of their interactions and complexities, and we will touch that. So, to maybe enamor myself a bit to my North American friends, I thought I'd use a great American philosopher to set the scene for the future. And essentially, what I'm arguing, I asked for gin, but I guess I'll use water. And I'm arguing that what Yogi Berra said nearly 50 years ago is far more pertinent today than it was at that time. We are not in a time of change. We're not in a time even of reforms. I would argue, ladies and gentlemen, now that my uniform is off, that we are in an era of revolutions. And that these revolutions are of significance in as much as they are creating complexities for us to be able to respond to get ahead of the game, to wrest the initiative from those who are, in fact, perpetrating the conflicts or preventing the conflicts from actually being avoided. I'm just going to throw three of them up very rapidly. The first one I talk about is the environmental one, which we've just started, and we are just starting to realize that if there's not a communion between humanity and the planet, humanity will not thrive in the future. It will try to survive. And if that's the aim of humanity trying to survive, then I would say we've lost an edge that may have been there in the past that will hold us back from looking at humanity from a far more progressive way than we have demonstrated so far. I would contend that we want humanity to thrive, and even at 7 billion going God knows to what level, the aim is how will it continue to be able to do that on this planet without us also trying to blow the place apart with the nuclear proliferation and the weakness of our disarmament arguments. The information one is also just starting, and as we looked at when I was running the reform of the Canadian Officer Corps at the turn of the century, we went to futurists to give us a feel for that. As you know, in the military realm, we tend to push technology because we're always worried that the other guy has got an edge on us. And the futurists told us that we would be, by 2020, into the biomechanical interfacing of human beings, and also that our method of deductive reasoning would be too slow. We would actually have to create a whole new philosophical base to find a way of maximizing the information systems and the capabilities we have in order to take advantage of them. So how do you prepare your officer corps, your leaders, for the future when, in fact, we're going to have to completely shift how we handle that information need? And are we actually leading that, or are we being led by the technology and technologists? And that's why I like to throw up Google. What happens if Google goes rogue? I mean, who is really controlling Google? And worse, who's going to be giving the focus to the successor of Google? There's a big argument going on between the Harvard Library and Google and the American government because it can digitize all out-of-print material, and the limitations of what it does and doesn't do with that material and what it does want to use have not been established. So as we Googleize more, are we actually being led down a path that we want to move down with our ability to master what's out there and to continue to thrive? Or are we being led down something that we have really not looked at, it being the most responsible or in fact, the way we want to see the maximizing of that technology. So we're sort of stumbling into things that are guiding us without us really needing them. And in so doing, one could argue that we could be led down a garden path and ultimately not necessarily go down the way that we would hope to continue to advance humanity. And security is the other one that I like to touch on. And I will just use this as my less complicated slide of the day to argue that if your organization or anyone in your organization has a philosophy of "it ain't broke, don't fix it," then you are in a regressive organization. If you are in any entity or organization that is hoping to establish status quo, then you are actually regressing. For status quo in this era is unsustainable. Status quo is not a straight line. Status quo is going down, while everybody who is moving is actually moving up exponentially. And so, are you in that frame of mind? Is your organization, is your entity, is in fact the intellectual exercises of your organization to face the problems of today and of the future, looking at it with that in mind, that everything moves. There is nothing that's in concrete anymore. And if it is, it might be a hindrance to you to be able to face the challenges of the future. And so, with that in mind, and I was nearly going to say, the good old days are over. And I'm not sure whether we should be saying that or not, but the Cold War was fairly simplistic. And we had it right down to drills. I mean, we had the things sorted out. I knew when I was in Germany exactly where my gun positions were and everything and what we had to do, and we just waited for the word to go. That sort of Eurocentric, simplistic scenario, of course, took a nosedive at the end of the Cold War in '89, and we've been trying to pick up where we're going from there. And some of it has not turned out to be very cute or very easy to define. And in fact, we've found ourselves in a number of conflicting scenarios with what we've used traditionally as disciplines to meet the requirements. The disciplines of diplomacy, politics, of security, of humanitarianism, and nation building, and so on. These sort of one after another sequential tools used when conflict would happen between nation states simply aren't working anymore. What we're seeing now is concurrent activity. We're seeing the diplomatic efforts, we're seeing the security efforts, we're seeing the humanitarian, the nation-building efforts, all having to operate at the same time, in the same place. And ultimately, if we ever come to the resolution of conflict, how do you adapt that to assist the nation in going on into the future, with the limitations that the politicians are imposing upon us? We've created a political elite that is actually totally at odds with our ability to do reconciliation and ultimately re-nation building. Why? Because the politicians are pragmatic, that's okay. They are often very tactical, I mean very local. But the third one, which really throws us off when we work at the strategic level, is they're very short term. What's in the New York Times tomorrow morning that will affect me in power. So if you're into these reconciliation exercises and you are engaged, you've got to be ready to be there for 40 to 60 years. Anything under that will not necessarily meet the requirement. And if you're working from even the political structures of our 4 to 5 year sequences where we are so Cartesian and impatient to get results, we're into a complete dichotomy. I mean, we're actually bicéphale. One side, the problem is long-term and in depth with long commitments, and the other side is saying, I need results tomorrow morning and I'm very short-term. And so I use the example back home as we have pulled out of the combat mission in Afghanistan and moved to more the training mission, is I'm saying, why are we saying that 10 years in assisting in nascent democracy is too long and we should be shifting gears? We've been in Cyprus for over 50 years. Nobody's told us to get out of there. They haven't solved the problem. They're not killing each other. They're talking. The economies are thriving. And maybe in another 20 years, they won't need that green line anymore. And they'll actually create whatever sort of structure they need. So what's 70 years? in bringing a country, a nation state, to a level of stability that it can actually thrive. And so if we're picking and choosing, and we're particularly doing that not necessarily because of the humanitarian side or the human side, because we're doing it in self-interest and we've got short-term aims, how do you bring in instruments to support elements that need decades to be resolved? There are no shortcuts. The question is do you have the ability to sustain that? And if you don't, then ultimately you're undermining the efforts you're doing. And you're setting up the whole exercise to failure. So there was in this sort of last 20-odd years the odd little spurt of sort of giving the classic warriors a warm, fuzzy feeling. This is sort of the last hurrah, maybe in 2003 again, when went into Iraq the second time, but essentially that's sort of the last hurrah of classic use of force against classic forces. And I mean, that one morning when General Schwarzkopf opened the flap of his tent, looked at the sun, studied the entrails of a pigeon, and said, "Go," and took on another army with all its equipment and uniforms and lines and minefields and everything else, and they did essentially attrition warfare in the classic sense, and the last one left standing wins. I mean, that was the last hurrah of this era. That is to say, the last hurrah of the classic era as we stumbled into this new era, which is going to be with us for decades to come. So the classicists who are still around hoping that we'll get that ability to use all this stuff in a sort of linear fashion as we did in the past, you better put them aside because they're in the wrong era. And we need to project far more capabilities than purely our combat skills. The warrior ethic isn't enough to meet the requirements of our era. And so what will those other skills be as we move to that is in fact the essence of a lot of the discussions that should be going on in regards to that third phase of reconciliation. So we're in an era of enormous complexity, and contrary, I guess, to George Bush Sr., who, with the peace dividend of 1990-ish, hoped for a new world order, I would argue we're into a disorder only because we haven't figured it out. And we haven't gained the initiative yet. We're still reacting, and we're still learning. We're still on-job training. We're still crisis managing. And so the scale, and I don't want to go back too much to that, of the impact on humanity over the last 20-odd years are off any scale. And in particular, when you look at the impact on children. And the reason I threw that slide up is that if you're into a reconciliation structure and attempting to help reconciliation, where nations that have been imploding and are been in conflict have at times in their demographics over 50% of the population under the age of 15, and they've seen nothing but war and conflict and frictions due to tribalism, ethnicity, religion, or simply power sharing, how do you bring them along into the new era? How do they actually gain a sense of confidence that what's coming down the road is far more positive than what they've actually known so far and have been significantly influenced? So the whole dimension of youth is an overriding dimension because it is also the great source of the frictions continuing. Because the disenfranchised youth in so many of those countries are ideal recruits to continue whatever conflict or friction that has been created. And in so doing, without them being brought along, you are simply stalling it for it to rekindle itself and to come back alive. And so, with these massive abuses of human rights, and the scale and the type and I was nearly going to say the quality, the nature of the frictions, how can you bring them back together? How can you actually reestablish an atmosphere of serenity within these nation states that are already suffering from significant problems, of which poverty is probably a dominant one, let alone the sharing of power? And that brings us to how I believe we stumbled into an era of not only ethnic cleansing, but actually genocide. We actually stumbled into that era, and that tool being overtly there. No matter how much of the wording in the international laws have been established, it's happened, it's happening, and it's being used. I mean, it's being planned. It's a plan. When you have one of the belligerents that actually plans on eliminating the other ethnicity that's part of that nation structure, artificial as it was created from the colonial era, and that in that extremist element that still is there and has still tentacles within their organization, their ethnicity, that they actually plan to maintain power by literally wiping out the other side. How, in fact, can you bring those two sides together? How can you bring the next generations together when that concept existed and hasn't been, as such, totally eradicated, either by the International Criminal Court or even by the justice processes within the countries, which should be absolutes that would help you to move down that road. Well, if you don't have them all and you don't have that demonstrated, then it means that that capability still is there and that it can rekindle, in fact, the conflict into it. So we sort of caught ourselves out by finding ourselves into a whole variety of scenarios that were created by the end of the Cold War and the influence of the great powers into a whole series of conflicts where it is not nation state against nation state, but it is imploding nations, and it is, in fact, failing states. And what are the requirements, in fact, to prevent and ultimately to reconcile them? And one of the elements that is out there that I've used when I was at the Kennedy School is the following example. I was asked by the rector or the president of Boston College, which is a Jesuit Catholic university, to come and speak about the Rwandan genocide. And this is in 2004. 10 years later. And he asked me to speak about the Catholic Church and the Rwandan genocide. And so I, as he requested, sent him the title of my presentation. And the title of my presentation was The Complicity of the Catholic Church of Rwanda in the Rwandan Genocide. Well, you can imagine how that went across. And the number of emails that went between him and me in regards to what I was going to argue. And I went it was an open session to students and faculty, and for my presentation, argued how the Catholic Church had in fact nurtured the separation of the ethnicities. And it had in fact favored one ethnicity against the other. And in so doing, in its schools, in the areas where you would think neutral, there was influence. And in its structure, one ethnicity was advantaged more than the other because the president was a very practicing individual in that religion. However, at the end of it, I said, are the great religions of our time instruments of reconciliation or sources of friction? And then I articulated that only after 9/11, in fact, on the 24th of January 2002, did Pope JP II bring the great religions together in Assisi, and actually, after 2 days of discussions, articulated that no religion calls for any of its members to kill in the name of its religion. That's been the only sort of overt position taken by the great religions as they tried to bring about this complex era. So after saying that, there was an hour worth of discussion. And the hour of discussion was far more on whether the religious structures out there, the great religions, are instruments of reconciliation or sources of friction. And at the end of that hour, in that Catholic Jesuit university, the jury was out. There was no consensus. There was absolutely no consensus on that fact. Now throw that into the exercise of attempting to move the yardsticks in these nations. And so we are in an era that has these complexities. I'm throwing up very rapidly the ethical and moral and legal dilemmas of our time, and that influence, of course, how we can, in the field, respond to these new demands without necessarily having the conceptual base behind it to actually help us find the solutions, that we're playing often from the seat of our pants. And so mandates and missions are not classic. Ambiguity and complexity are the norms. Ethical, moral, and legal dilemmas abound. If you want to go back to the old days, I don't blame you. But this is what you're into up to our necks. And we're deploying people into the field with that out there. And how are they doing? And how are we doing? And have we wrested the initiative from those who want to continue the frictions of the differences to continue to lead to conflict? Or are we actually attenuating, diffusing those frictions by what we are able to offer in those nation states? Well, I argued earlier on that there is in this era very much a component of many of the conflicts that are not playing by any of the rules whatsoever. They're completely off the grid and have no desire to be constrained by international law, humanitarian law, law of armed conflict. And one of the great fears is that we fall down that same trap, that we actually go down the same route in order to try to counter their presence, and in so doing lose our credibility. If we are fiddling with civil liberties, if we're fiddling with human rights, if we're fiddling with the international conventions, how do you then impose them upon, or how do you assist nation states in building their structures, their nation, according to them? And if we are actually going down that road, how far do we go? How much torture do we permit? How many civil liberties do we limit? What conventions do we pick and choose when we feel like it? So instead of bringing a whole new set of innovative solutions to this complex era, we've essentially sort of more or less tried to fiddle, not, of course, to any way the extremism that's out there, but we are fiddling with some of our basic references, and in so doing are undermining our ability to be credible, to reconcile, to assist those nations in going beyond the frictions that have brought them into the problem in the first place. So the old tools ain't working. So what's the new tools? If that stuff just ain't there, that people don't want to use it, then we've got three options in doing it. And this, I hope this conference is going for the third one, really. The first one is you hope that nobody knows you're there. I'm from Canada, that's possible. I mean, who the hell wants to invade a place that's full of snow, like back home in Quebec City right now? If you, when you, of course, you're serving here in the United States now, just look at an American weatherman's map. And what do you see north of the United States? Nothing. You don't even get Canada, except when they want to give you a hard time because a cold Arctic blast is coming from Canada. So nobody knows we're there. And in that case, we can hope that maybe we can stay as a middle power, hidden in our corner, and let the rest of the world sort itself out, and we'll fiddle on the margins. That is an option. And that is an option of isolation that a number of countries are trying to get away with, but there is no way that that will work. New York is pretty damn close to Montreal. And so even in a country like ours, where we feel that certain chance of isolation, it won't work. The next one is build the wall, and I use that because after 9/11, we had 9/12. And the next morning, from down here, we got phone calls saying, you know, you guys up there are a bit of a sieve in regards to security, so it's time that we build a sort of security zone. What we'll do is we'll build Fortress North America. We'll build a wall around the place, or sort of a virtual wall. We won't let anybody in who's got a black mustache or something like that, and we'll let it go downhill. So the concept is that simply securing the place would provide us that level of protection that would permit us then to continue to function. But the third option is certainly what I hope is what we're feeling and what we believe in, and that is going to the source of the rage in humanity and actually trying to attenuate it there. And doing that in a proactive fashion in regards to assisting nations that have failed in reducing the frictions that are created by their history, their structures, their religions, and so on, or in a timely fashion deploying in order to attenuate the conflicts and prevent it from going viral, and in so doing, make it nearly impossible to resolve. Well, that requires political will. How much time do I got left? None? Okay. Political will is the great kicker in all this. And in so doing, who can we actually look at in regards to giving us that guidance to actually participate in reducing those conflicts or attenuating the possibility of those conflicts? And so the political masters, are they up to snuff to meet it? Are, in fact, the policy people able to grasp the complexity of our time and giving us that sense of leadership that we need to take the risks to go in and into arenas that we really don't know fully the outcome? Or are we holding back and saying, I need an clear exit strategy? Bullshit. That don't exist. There is no such thing in this era. There's nothing that clear because it hasn't been defined. We don't know the full breadth of the factors and how they're interacting in order to be able to discern that. What is sure is that the use of force to protect is responsible. Beyond that, what can we do? Do we simply wait, or do we participate in trying to help resolve the conflict? Do we need other sets of skills in order to participate in attenuating the conflict and then ultimately participating in its the reconciliation thereof, which means preventing it to happen again? What are those other more maybe intellectually based skills and knowledge that we require in uniform beyond our warrior ethic to be effective and to be fully participant in the process? And so I'm going to run through the slides rapidly in order to get to a couple very specific points. One is, we are now in an era where the political masters are managing problems and not demonstrating leadership because they're risk adverse. And the premise I use is that leadership will always produce results far beyond what the science of management says is possible. So, if we're managing the problems, we're not bringing innovative solutions, we're just trying to hold the line. Darfur and many other conflicts are like that. Only leadership and risk-taking by nations and the willingness to use other factors in self-interest will actually permit us to go in and prevent conflicts, let alone resolve them. So the will to intervene by our political masters is still, I would believe, at a low level. And too often, the question is, what's in it for me, and how do I sustain my ability to continue to run the country or stay in power? Secondly, what's in the self-interest of the nation? What am I going to be held accountable for, ultimately, for using these resources and taking the risks? And thirdly, which really came in the 90s to the fore far more, is the fear of casualties. The fear of casualties, particularly in missions that have no self-interest or are not for a specific gain except humanitarianism. There is an argument that's out there amongst the militaries that say that you should not take any casualties when you are in a humanitarian mission or when you are in a Chapter 6 type of mission. And again, I say that's BS. If you're not prepared when you're deploying forces to take casualties, then send the Boy Scouts. And so there is the risk of casualties. But many of the mandates are articulated in order to prevent you from actually even being able to use the capabilities, to which in the end might reduce your casualties, and in so doing create enormous dilemmas in applying those mandates into the field. And so the fear of casualties is an overriding factor in many of the decision makings in different countries. I would argue that in Canada, the loss of life of our troops in Afghanistan was a far stronger argument for us to start pulling out than actually succeeding in achieving the mission. The mission is when the diplomats and the generals and the people on the ground say we've been able to achieve it and hand it over, or we need other capabilities to achieve it. And it's not when it's politically cute to pull out, particularly when you spilt blood. And so that sort of quandary is always in the back of the decision-making of our nations and our politicians. And so will they want to intervene? And will they want to take the risks? Will middle powers want to take on more responsibility? I was in front of the Senate committee here on human rights and the law with Senator Durbin looking at Darfur. And I was asked by a Republican senator, well, what should the United States do with Darfur? And I said, the first thing you do is don't come in. Why should the world powers be the first ones in? Why isn't there a coalition of middle powers who are going in first, who maybe have a different perspective on the situation and are perceived differently than the world powers? And from then, look at keeping the world powers in overwatch and their political will behind us to decide how to move to the future, which brings a country like mine into question of what it wants to do in this era. And how does it want to function? Before a conflict, during a conflict, and certainly afterwards. And are we, in fact, willing to engage? And so I won't go into responsibility to protect, because that's a debate in itself, nor the reasons or the criteria, although Libya might be a question you might want to raise. These are a new force of great significance. These are a great new player on the block. They are growing in the thousands. They are there before, during, and after the conflicts. They are the eyes and ears of humanity, and although they love to operate independently, they are more and more coalescing. And they will become, ladies and gentlemen, the voice of humanity. They will be the instrument of influencing the nation states in their policies and in their decisions into the future. And in so doing, how do we function with them? How do we complement each other? In about a year and a half ago, General McChrystal was still in command. And we won't discuss the decision makings of the American government in regards to that gentleman. But we were interviewing him. I'm the deputy chair of our defense committee, and we were discussing about the Canadian involvement in Afghanistan. And as we were going through different things, I asked him the following question. I said, what are you doing with the NGOs on the ground? And his response was, nothing. It came blatant, nothing. And complimented it, or that is to say explained it, by the fact that they don't want to do anything with us. They want to keep their humanitarian space. They want to keep that neutrality. The same NGOs who are prepared to give 20% of what they have to the warlords in order to bring 80% in to help, the same NGOs who are prepared to hire every security company that has absolutely no ethos nor any real rules of engagement, they'll hire them for their protection but not use military forces. And so there is a real serious problem between the NGO community, which has enormous sources of information and abilities to function, and those structured organizations, be they government development people, the military, security, police, and so on, and diplomats, in trying to wrest that initiative and be effective in the field. And so in the process of the post-conflict reconciliation, if you're not intimately engaged with them, you've lost a whole part of the exercise, not only intelligence-wise, but the ability to influence. And so the NGO community is a growing force and will continue to gain power globally because they are without borders. And the youth of our nations are going towards them more and more and want to join them. And I just throw that one up as a little sideshow. As I was working for Minister of International Development on child protection, the door slammed open one day and 3 guys came in with big red noses on. And I thought they were Cirque du Soleil. So I said, "Who are you clowns?" And they said, "That's right, we're Clowns Without Borders." And I said, "What do you do?" They say, and these were 19, 20-year-olds. They say, "We go into refugee camps and internally displaced camps, and we teach children games. We teach children how to laugh, to help them survive the conditions in which they're in." They cover the full spectrum of humanity. And although principally humanitarian-based, there are a few wackos on the fringes that we got to worry about, but essentially they're all focused, not finding ways to solve that humanitarian space, that neutrality argument that is historically there, that I believe is not effective in our era, will continue to stymie our ability to wrest the initiative. And so, ladies and gentlemen, the old ways of doing business, in our silos, in our stovepipes, in our separate plants, simply cannot work. Continuing to adapt old concepts of the classic era and fiddling with them is not going to work. What we need in our era is a whole new conceptual base. So we don't need to cooperate or coordinate or collaborate, because what that means is you continue to do what you've been doing, but often personality driven in the field, you sort of fiddle to make things happen better. What I argue is we've got to integrate. And if we're integrating, that means a whole new set of tools. It means not being the same. It means not essentially operating from our stovepipes, but how do we get a whole new generation of leadership and concepts structured in order to work the synergy of all these capabilities. That's the future. And that's how we will prevent things. That's how you're into making reconciliation effective. And so we need to innovate, create, and lead a new conceptual base for multidisciplinary leaders. Generals who know how to fight and are credible to fight are limited in their use in this era. We need a far more intellectually based balance between the experientially based ability to fight credibly and be prepared to do so, and the intellectually based skills and knowledge in order to participate in helping resolve the conflict or preventing conflicts or these frictions to go to conflict. And so some of the solutions that include a whole new lexicon. And I speak to you as military, because we operate from lexicons. We operate from lexicons of action verbs. During the Cold War, it was attack, defend, withdraw, bypass. They were very classic instruments and action verbs of the doctrines of our time, and we knew exactly what they meant. The Russians knew what they meant. Everybody knew what they meant. However, when I was sent to Rwanda, the mandate I got was, in 1993, after 30 years in NATO, was establish an atmosphere of security. So what does establish mean? What's the doctrine behind the action verb establish in that mission statement? What is the concept behind it? How far do I push the troops? Do I defend that country when I'm demobilizing both armies against a third party? Do I simply watch? What are the limits to establish? And what is an atmosphere of security? Police state, no weapons. And so we stumbled into an era where there are words, but there's no depth to them. There's no conceptual depth to conflict resolution, let alone conflict prevention, of which reconciliation and reconstitution of nation states are a leading element to avoid these frictions. And so in the early century, with the reform back home, I was able to introduce what we call the enhanced leadership model for our officer corps, where we introduced anthropology, sociology, philosophy, against a lot of Cold Warrior seniors who felt that that was going to emasculate the warrior ethic. And on the contrary, what we've discovered is the warrior ethic is solid in this new generation of leaders, and they're actually able to maneuver with this stuff and try to adapt it to the field, to keep the weapons behind and try to be more progressive, anticipatory, and participatory in the problem solving. And so there are a number of reforms. I don't want to take too much time. I'm already gone beyond that. That I think at the strategic level that have to be initiated and that we should actually move upon. And one of them is the big powers kicking the butts of the middle powers to get engaged, to be in the front lines, to actually be the first ones in. And in so doing, keeping the bigger powers in overwatch, in reserve, with the political will to back us up, but not necessarily their commitment. And then, should it fail, then what's left? If a big power gets a bloody nose and turns tail, what does it leave us with? What can we do in regards to the problem? And certainly, how can that ultimately emasculate the UN? And so, very rapidly, the last slides, I believe reconciliation in many of these countries in conflict, the dominant instrument that is to be used in concert with the new way of functioning with the NGO community is empowerment of women. These male-dominated societies don't have the flexibility, I believe, to be able to handle the problem from the grassroots up. And that whole side of their cultural structures, their political structures, their sociological structures have never been or have not been maximized. And so empowerment of women, in my opinion, is crucial to reconciliation. They can handle that depth. They're the ones that bring life and actually see that continuum. Secondly, education, education, education. They need the intellectual rigor to understand the problems in order to bring about objective solutions. So education, education, and moving from an atmosphere of tolerance that we seem to be comfortable with to an actual level of respect. Where, ladies and gentlemen, as I will ebb because I still got another 100 slides, with the following. Are all humans human? Or are some more human than others? Do some human beings count more than others as humans? Are they actually more human? And in so doing, permit to establish pecking orders on how we will respond to the plight of humanity. Remembering we started with that concept of humanity. If we are all equal, because we respect each other, then that can, in fact, ultimately move the criteria of humanity up the scale to take on self-interest. And that, to me, is an objective. And I'll use this last anecdote to make my point. During the genocide, I was able to negotiate people from either ethnicity to be able to go move them between the lines, behind the lines of their own group. And so we were starting to move people. And in one of the negotiation rounds, I was going through no man's land between the two fighting forces, because you've got warring factions actually going on, and then you've got the slaughtering going on behind the lines. And so there's a no man's land, and I'm driving through this no man's land, and up ahead of a couple hundred meters, there's a little boy, about 6 years old or so, in the middle of no man's land. And what the extremists were doing in order to stop and replenish their bins to be able to continue their slaughtering was they would intercept humanitarian convoys by putting children on the road. And the kids would then not move because they'd kill them outright. And so the convoy would stop, they'd attack convoy, steal the water, food, medical supplies, and so on. So expecting an ambush, slowed down, stopped, jumped out. I had a couple of soldiers with me, no ambush. Went to the huts along the road to see who would be there to take care of this kid who shouldn't be there in the first place, and just found bodies of people who had been killed weeks beforehand. As we're looking, we lose the child. So we double back and we find him in the hut where there are two adults, male, female, a couple of children, and they're half eaten by dogs and rats, and he's sitting there as if he's at home. So I picked him up and I brought him in front of my vehicle and I looked at him, and his stomach was bloated, he was in rags, he was dirty, he was mangy, flies all around him, he was cut. But then I looked into his eyes. And what I saw in the eyes of that 6-year-old boy in the middle of that civil war and genocide was exactly what I saw in the eyes of my 7-year-old son when I left for Africa. They were the eyes of a human child, and they were exactly the same. That kid in the middle of that mess was just as human and counted equally as my son back home. Thank you very much.